Hey, Lake Point, Pastor Micah here with a recap of the fourth week of our Last Kingdom series. And throughout it, we're unpacking the idea of Jesus being eternity's king. Now, if you've ever delivered a eulogy or sat in a pew at a funeral or stood at a graveside during a committal, it sure feels like death has the final word, doesn't it? Like it wins. But this week we explored the question of what if death is not the winner we typically think it to be? You see, in the first century, there was a man who was absolutely convinced of that truth. He was even convinced that the cross was actually a battlefield. And that man's name was Paul. Now, if you've read 1 Corinthians chapter 15 before, you know that Paul provides this long, detailed explanation of the resurrection. And it's a dense piece of scripture. It's the kind of passage where you read it and then you immediately reread it, telling yourself, okay, that was English, but let's try that again. However, if you're able to kind of survive to the end of the chapter, you'll see Paul do something a little unexpected. He starts taunting death. He starts trash talking death. That he personifies it as a defeated enemy. In verse 54, Paul writes, "Death has been swallowed up in victory." Paul wants his readers to know a battle took place and that death lost. Actually, more than that, he wants his readers to know that death didn't just lose the battle, death lost the entire war. And so Paul is feeling so confident, so assured of what's been accomplished, he just keeps smack talking his defeated enemy, our defeated enemy. In verse 55, he says, "Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting?" He's like, for so long, humanity feared you, we dreaded you, we lived under your shadow, and now what? You're a scorpion with no tail. And then he tries to make it as clear as possible for his readers. Paul writes this, he says, "The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law, but thanks be to God, he gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ." Now, if Paul were speaking to us in person and telling us all of this, we'd probably have a clarifying question for him at this point to make sure we're really grasping what he's communicating. We'd probably be like, wait, are you claiming Jesus defeated death itself? And Paul's like, yeah, why does that surprise you? Do you not know the story? And we're like, well, we thought we did. The church we grew up had used a flannel graph to teach me that God created, mankind sinned, God sent Jesus, believing in him equals heaven, not believing in him equals hell. Like, that's the story, right, Paul? That's the tree I hang all of my other beliefs on. And Paul would say, no, that's not the main story. That's a piece of it, but you've missed the plot. And so you might say, let me try again. And imagine if we were having an actual conversation with Paul, he would direct us to what he wrote in his letter to the Romans. "For if by the trespasses of one man death reigned through that one man, how much more will those who receive God's abundant provision of grace and of the gift of righteousness reign in life through the one man, Jesus Christ?" Now, did you catch it? Paul says death reigned. Death wasn't just something that happened, it ruled like a king. Paul is saying from Adam onward, death sat on the throne over all of humanity. But then Paul provides us with hope. He says, if sin entered the world through one man and death came to reign because of that, then what do you think happens when God sends a king to fight sin and death? He says, how much more? How much more will those who receive God's grace, how much more will those who receive God's righteousness reign in life through King Jesus? And when you hear that, you may be like, wait, reign, like now? And Paul says, yeah, right now. You don't have to live under dread anymore. You don't have to live in fear because death doesn't reign anymore. Really, Paul wants you to know that death is the byproduct of sin. What we see from the very beginning, sin is a cause, death is an effect. And Paul wants you to know that Jesus crushed sin and death and he rendered them both powerless over you. And so, if we were talking to Paul at this point, we'd be kind of like, okay, I think I'm getting it, but like, how did this happen and when did this happen? Well, let's explore the story. We'll begin with Jesus on his way into Jerusalem, fully prepared for battle, but not the battle any of his disciples expected. They were ready for him to wage war on Rome. They were ready for him to take down the religious leaders. And yet, and this is easy to miss, Jesus actually enters Jerusalem to fight on behalf of Rome, to fight on behalf of the temple leaders, and on behalf of you, and on behalf of me. The enemy he's come to face isn't Caesar, it's not the Pharisees, he's not there just merely to forgive sin. He's been doing that all along. He's there to deal with what sin unleashes, death. Now, if you step back and piece together the full story from all the Gospels, everything starts moving pretty fast. Jesus enters the city, then disappears. He shows up in the temple, then disappears again. Every night he leaves the city, spends the night outside, then early in the morning he's back teaching in the temple courts. Day after day, in and out, back and forth. And the political and social temperature of the city just keeps rising. The religious leaders have people planted throughout the city. They want to arrest him, and they need to know where he is. More importantly, they need to know how they can separate him from the people, because amongst the crowd, he is untouchable. However, somewhere in the crowd is a man named Judas. He's one of the 12, and sometime during that week, it hits him. This isn't going anywhere. Sometime during the week, Judas starts thinking, I've wasted 3.5 years following a wannabe king, a wannabe Messiah. This dude clearly isn't going to do what I want him to do. And so he decides to salvage what he can. He goes to the temple leaders and makes them an offer. Hey, I can get you to him. For the right price, I will hand him over. And so a deal is struck. Now, don't kid yourself. Jesus knows. He knows what's unfolding behind the scenes. And so he quietly arranges a place in the city to celebrate Passover with his 12, a private, discreet location, perhaps to keep Judas from making his move in the middle of the meal, because Jesus had some things he wanted to say and do first. You see, two extraordinary things happen at that Passover dinner. First, he announces a new covenant, a completely new arrangement between God and humanity, a new covenant not just for one nation, but for all nations, not just for one people, but for all people, the whole world invited in. And then in that same meal, he gives a new command. Love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. Folks, only a king can establish a new law like that, a new command, a new marching order. Now, after the meal, they leave and they head to the Garden of Gethsemane. And right on cue, Judas shows up, not alone, but with an armed escort. And yet, Jesus doesn't resist. Peter tries to resist with violence, but Jesus shuts it down. He even rebukes him, because that's not the kind of king he is. As we see in the story, they arrest Jesus and they take him to the high priest. And they think, the high priest and them, they think they finally have him caged in a corner, and they're feeling so good about themselves. They begin to berate him. They question and they accuse. They question and they accuse over and over again. And Jesus says nothing. He meets all of it with silence, until finally the high priest, the most powerful religious figure in that region, a man who lived with king-like authority, leans in. He says, enough, just tell us, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? And in this moment, they're asking him, are you claiming to be God? Because Rome is going to take issue with that. Or are you claiming to be the Son of God? Because we're going to take issue with that. And in that moment, everything hangs in the balance, because how Jesus answers that question determines everything. His future, their future, your future. And when he's ready, and on his term, not theirs, he replies, I am. He answers yes to both. Am I king? Yep. Am I God himself? Yeah. And that's all they need to hear. In their minds, it's total blasphemy. And so they take Jesus to Pilate, because they can't execute him themselves. They need Rome's permission. However, Pilate is not convinced Jesus even deserves to die, so he does what he hopes will satisfy the crowd without going all the way. He has Jesus flogged. The Roman auxiliaries, they mock him, they beat him, but then they do something they don't realize the significance of. They twist together a crown of thorns and they press it onto his head. And in doing so, they created an enduring icon for our king, exactly as Jesus intended. Pilate tries again and again to release him, but it goes nowhere. And so he brings Jesus out one more time. He says to the crowd, here is your king. And the crowd shouts, take him away, crucify him. Shall I crucify your king? Pilate asked. They answer, we have no king but Caesar. And with those 6 words, Pilate hands him over to be crucified. And they bring him to a place called Golgotha, and the text just says it simply, there they crucified him. Your king displayed on a criminal's cross. And as one of my favorite songs says, darkness rejoiced as though heaven had lost. It looked like just another would-be Messiah had come in God like all the others. But friends, know what looked like defeat was actually strategy. And that old rugged cross was about to become the emblem of a risen victorious king. On the other side of the resurrection, everything actually comes into focus. The story that once felt scattered suddenly comes full circle. And one of the first to see it most clearly is the Apostle Paul. And he says, here's what happened. On that Good Friday, something decisive took place. Death, your greatest enemy, was defeated, swallowed up, overpowered on the battlefield. And then here's the accompanying promise for you and I. If death couldn't hold him, it won't hold us either. Paul closes out the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians with this. He says, therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. Paul is saying what God is doing in history, in your life, in this generation, it's moving somewhere. It's moving towards something. And when you step into that, when you serve, when you follow, when you live under his leadership, it is not a waste. It's actually participating in the very thing you were always made to do, because you serve the King, God's final King, whose kingdom has come and whose will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Well, friends, thanks for listening. Enjoy jumping into discussion questions. I'll see you next time.